Here we are looking at a Khan Academy exercise that I like to assign to my students. And it's using the number that we see with correlation. This is Pearson's product moment correlation coefficients and several scatter plots. And we just want to use our best intuition to match what value of R we would expect to see with each plot. We're not really calculating it. We're just taking a look. So for example, scatter plot A, that's this green one right here. These points are like sort of all over the place. I can kind of almost see like it's going downhill. I mean, these two are kind of a mess. But the correlation is not great. I would definitely expect to be looking at a value close to 0. And because I can imagine it kind of is going downhill this way, let's see if I can draw on this. They're kind of going like that in this like sort of larger cloud. I'm looking for a negative value close to 0. So right now it has negative 0.37. That is the closest number to 0 that I have in this list. So I'm going to leave it that way. Looking at scatterplot B, they are making a much tighter cloud. This, like all of the dots are in this cloud. It's clearly going uphill. So I expect that to be a number close to positive 1. And I look at all these possible values for my list, and I see here the highest number is 0.86. So I'm going to drag that up there so that scatterplot B has 0.86. Scrolling down, scatterplot C. Again, uphill. I would say it's going uphill. It's a larger area. That's like the width of the dots, but they're going uphill. So I would say that that is going to be a positive number, but certainly closer to 0, like not a very high number. So here I would say it's 0.67. In fact, in my mind, 0.67 seems a little high. I wouldn't expect to see such a clear pattern there, but it's a multiple choice. These are the only 4 options I have. And if I look at scatterplot B and C, looking here, these points are much more tightly packed than these points. So this value is definitely the larger number. Similarly, looking at D and A, these points are more tightly packed than these green ones. They're not great, but they're better. So I expect this number, the R value for this, to be much closer to -1 than this one. And because it's multiple choice, I only have these ones to choose from. So scatterplot D, negative 0.72, sure. It's downhill, it's making a negative correlation. It's not perfect, it's not a -1, but it's pretty okay. It's the most negative number that I have available. This next one, it's just the same thing. So I'm going to walk through a couple examples of this. So here I have 4 choices. I can move them around however I want. I mean, obviously not however I want to get them correct. So I'm looking at the scatter plots. Let's just take a look at the scatter plots at first. So D, that's really tightly packed. Those dots are really nice together. C is actually pretty okay. Like they are pretty tightly packed as well, but not as tight. So I expect scatterplot D to be a positive number, pretty close to 1. Scatterplot C is also a positive number, but it's not as close to 1. So coming up here, my biggest value is going to be the 0.86 and C is 0.65. Both of these are positive. Scatterplot D is closer to 1 because those points are making closer to a straight line than in C. So now let's look at A and B. A is kind of a mess. It's the closest to 0 I'm going to see. These dots are sort of everywhere. I can see that it's kind of going downhill, but these ones are throwing me for a loop. I'm not super jazzed about it. Here in scatterplot B, they are pretty nicely packed together. This is a nice cloud that seems to have a downward motion as I go to the right. So I expect scatterplot B to be a negative number closer to -1 than I would get here for scatterplot A. So coming up here, scatterplot B, that's my more negative value. And scatterplot A, that's my 0.42. Like it's not great correlation. I'm not very confident that this relationship really is even representing a relationship between the X variable and the Y variable. Let's walk through 2 more examples. So here, first, let's go down and look at the scatter plot. If I look at these first 2, scatter plot A is clearly going uphill. It is not that tight, but it is positive. Maybe I'm looking at something between 0.6 and 0.8. I'm not really sure, but I do expect it to be a positive value. And of these 4, it's going to be the most positive because this makes the nicest tightest uphill shape that I can see. Scatter plot B is pretty much everywhere. I expect this to be pretty close to 0 because I've seen this Khan Academy assignment before. I'm going to guess it's actually a positive value, maybe like 0.3, 0.4, but not as high of a number as for scatter plot A. Let's go up here. We want our highest value to go to A, and then the scatter plot B is 0.3. Like, that's not good. These points are sort of all over. Now let's look at C and D. C, they're both going downward, but C is making a much tighter cloud here. The spread out of these points is not as much. They're really closely together, whereas in D, they're sort of everywhere. So I expect scatterplot C to be the one that has the more negative value, closer to -1 than I would see with scatterplot D. So I come up here, scatterplot C is the more negative number, closer to this perfect negative correlation. Here's our last example. So let's take a look at the scatter plots. It's Khan Academy, there's always 2 positive and 2 negative. That's not how it's going to be always in life, but that is this exercise. So if I look at these, C and D, those are my uphill positive numbers, and A and B, those are my negative numbers. If I first look at A and B, scatterplot A is making a much tighter shape than scatterplot B. Scatterplot B is sort of all over the place. So scatterplot A is my more negative number, closer to -1. Both A and B are negative, but A is closer to -1. So I come up here, most close to -1 is scatterplot A, the other negative is scatterplot B. We look at C and D. Both are positive, both are going uphill, but scatterplot C is much more tightly packed. These points are all closer together, which means this is the number that's closer to 1. So scatterplot C is the closest to 1, and scatterplot D is the other positive value. That's the end of this video. It was just introducing these values for Pearson's product moment correlation coefficient and this one Khan Academy exercise where we use our intuition to match the value that we see with R with different scatter plots that we're looking at.